The air at the Hemlock Farm auction hung thick and heavy with the ghosts of last year's harvest, a mix of damp earth, diesel fumes, and the sweet, sad smell of decay. It was late March, 1972. The ground was too soft to work, but the itch was in every man's hand. It was the kind of day that pulled farmers from their workshops and kitchens, drawing them to the slow public dissection of a neighbor's life. Old man Hemlock had passed in his sleep, and his kids, scattered to cities like dandelion seeds, wanted cash, not land. I stood near the back, my hands stuffed deep in the pockets of my canvas work coat, just watching. My name is Silas Blackwood. I farmed the quarter section my grandfather broke with mules, the same piece of dirt my father defended from the bankers during the Depression. I learned my lessons from him, lessons written in calluses and scarcity. The main one, if you can't pay cash, you can't afford it. The auctioneer's rhythmic chant rolled over the crowd, a hypnotic cadence that could coax a man's wallet right out of his overalls. Most of the good stuff was already gone. The John Deere 4020, barely 5 years old, had gone for a price that made me wince. Earl Thompson bought it. Of course he did. Earl stood near the front, holding court. He was 10 years younger than me, with a soft jaw and the confident air of a man who'd never had to weld a cracked frame by lantern light. His farm, just down the road from mine, was a showcase. New machine shed, 2 towering blue harvester silos, and a fleet of green and yellow iron, so new you could still smell the paint baking in the sun. He wasn't buying the 4020 because he needed it. He was buying it so no one else could have it. He'd probably stick it on an auger and forget about it. "All right, folks, we're getting down to the bottom of the barrel now," the auctioneer squawked, his voice hoarse. "Let's move over to the fence row. Got a few odds and ends Mr. Hemlock collected over the years." The crowd thinned, the serious buyers drifting back toward their pickups. All that was left was the scrap, the forgotten projects. Tucked behind a crumbling corn crib, half swallowed by overgrown thistle, was the beast. It was a tractor, but only just. It was enormous, articulated in the middle like a giant wounded insect. 4 massive, bald tires held up a simple, brutal frame. The paint, what was left of it, was a faded industrial green, the kind you see on old bridges. Rust bloomed in great orange patches across the hood and fenders. The cab was a crude box of steel and glass, and from the side of the long engine, cowling protruded a huge canister-style air cleaner. It was a first-generation Steiger, a 1200 maybe. One of the early ones built in a barn in Minnesota, more blacksmithing than engineering. It was powered by a big screaming Detroit diesel, a green leaker as they were called. It was ugly, primitive and forgotten. A ripple of laughter went through the remaining handful of onlookers. Earl Thompson let out a loud guffaw. "Good Lord, what is that thing? Hemlock must have been planning to invade the next county." His buddies chuckled along with him. "Probably doesn't even run, Earl." "Run? I doubt the engine will even turn over," Earl shot back, loud enough for me to hear. "Scrapman will give you $50 for it, though. Might be $100 worth of bolts on it." The auctioneer looked defeated. "Well, what am I bid for this? This yard art? Who'll give me $100? 50? Somebody give me $25 to get it started." Silence. The only sound was the wind whistling through the bare branches of the oak trees. I knew that tractor. I'd seen Hemlock use it once, years ago, to pull a 5-shank V-ripper through ground so hard-packed it was like trying to plow a parking lot. The sound of that 2-stroke Detroit at full song was something you didn't forget. A furious, high-pitched roar that sounded like the world was tearing in half. It was raw power, with no creature comforts, no radio, no air conditioning, no synchromesh transmission. Just a series of levers, a loud pedal, and a whole lot of torque. "I'll bid $100, I said, my voice quiet but clear in the lull. Every head turned. Earl Thompson stared at me, a smirk playing on his lips. He looked me up and down, taking in my worn boots, my faded jeans, the grease permanently ground into the skin of my knuckles. He saw a man stuck in the past, a relic farming with relics. "Well, look at that," Earl said to his friends, his voice dripping with condescension. "Silas is going to start a museum. 100, he says. I'll bid 150, just to make it interesting." He was playing with me. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. 150 from Mr. Thompson. Do I hear 200? I knew Earl's game. He'd run me up a few $100s just for sport, to make me pay more than I should for a piece of junk. But I also knew the value of steel, and I knew what that Detroit 8V71 engine was worth, even as a core. And I knew what that planetary axle set could do. 200, I said, my gaze locked on the auctioneer. Earl's smirk widened. 250. 300, I countered, without hesitation. The crowd murmured. This was more than scrap price now. This was real money for a non-runner. Earl looked at me, then at the tractor. He was trying to figure out what I saw that he didn't. He saw a pile of rust. I saw potential. I saw paid for horsepower. 350, he said, the fun draining a little from his voice. 400, I said, my voice as flat and unmoving as the prairie horizon. Earl hesitated. $400 was half a month's payment on one of his new tractors. It was a sum that required thought. He looked at the Steiger again, at the oil stains on the ground beneath it, the cracked and weather-checked tires. He shook his head and laughed, a dismissive, arrogant sound. He can have it, Earl declared to the crowd. Lord knows what he'll do with it. Probably pull it home with his Farmel M. The auctioneer, sensing he'd gotten all he could, moved fast. $400 from Mr. Blackwood, sold for $400. He banged his imaginary gavel on his clipboard, and it was done. The beast was mine. As the crowd dispersed, Earl walked past me. He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to seem friendly but felt heavy with pity. You be careful with that thing, Silas. Wouldn't want you to get tetanus. I just nodded and watched him walk away, climbing into his new Ford F-250 with the chrome trim and the dealer sticker still in the window. I owned my farm, free and clear. My house was paid for, the tractors in my shed, a 1951 Farmel M my dad bought new, a John Deere 4010 with 10,000 hours on the clock, and a Gleaner E combine that still did the job. They were all mine. I didn't owe a dime to any man or any bank. Earl was leveraged up to his eyeballs, borrowing against the rising price of land to finance his empire of shiny green paint. We were playing two different games, him and me. He was playing for glory, I was just playing to stay. Now, before we get into the grease and the grit of bringing that old Steiger back to life, I gotta ask you all something. Have you ever bought something old and forgotten, something everyone else wrote off, only to prove them all wrong? Maybe it was a rusty toolbox, a seized-up engine, or an old piece of equipment left for dead in a fence row. Drop a comment below and tell me about the piece of iron you saved from the scrapyard. I'd sure like to hear about it. Getting the Steiger home was a chore in itself. The tires were flat and cracked, so I spent the better part of the afternoon wrestling with a split rim and a tire iron, patching the tubes enough to hold air. My neighbor, a quiet old bachelor named Henry, helped me tow it the 2 miles to my place with his Massey Ferguson 1155. It was a slow, groaning procession, the big green monster protesting every foot of the way. We parked it in the yard between the machine shed and the barn, where it listed to one side like a beached whale. It looked even bigger and uglier on my place, dwarfing my other tractors. For 2 days I just walked around it, studying it, letting it soak in. The frame was built of massive 8-inch channel iron welded together with heavy workmanlike beads. The articulation joint was a monstrous hinge with grease zerks the size of my thumb. Everything was overbuilt, designed not to break because there was no dealer network to call if it did. You were on your own. The third day I started. The first order of business was the engine. I pulled the dipstick. The oil was black as tar and thick as molasses, but it was there. That was a good sign. I put a 3-foot breaker bar on the crankshaft bolt at the front of the engine. I leaned into it with all my weight, my boots slipping on the oily ground. It didn't budge, seized solid. Earl's laughter echoed in my head. I could just picture him telling the boys down at the co-op coffee shop, Silas bought Hemlock's old anchor, engines locked up tighter than a banker's wallet. I wasn't beaten yet. I pulled the 8 big valve covers off the Detroit, exposing the rocker arms and injector assemblies. Then, one by one, I pulled the injectors, careful not to damage the copper sleeves they sat in. With the injectors out, I poured a mixture of automatic transmission fluid and acetone down each cylinder, an old-timer's trick for breaking rust. Then I waited. For a week I let it soak, adding more of the mixture each morning. I spent the time pressure washing decades of grease and dirt off the frame, tracing hydraulic lines, and figuring out the mess of wires under the dashboard. I found a mouse nest in the air cleaner canister and a family of wasps living in the battery box. The batteries, of course, were shot. While I worked, life in the county went on. Spring planting started. I got my corn in with the 4010 and my 6-row planter, making slow, steady progress. Every day, Earl Thompson would roar past my place on the road, sitting high in the climate-controlled cab of his brand-new John Deere 7520, pulling a 24-foot field cultivator. He'd wave, a big theatrical gesture that said, "Look at me, look how fast I'm going." I'd just lift a hand from my steering wheel and keep driving, the familiar drone of my old 2-cylinder John Deere a comforting sound in my ears. The talk at the feed mill was all about expansion. Land prices were climbing every month. Corn was over $2 a bushel and heading for $3. A man from the university had given a talk saying that farmers were going to have to get big or get out. Earl was the poster boy for that philosophy. He was renting another 200 acres, and rumor was he was trying to buy the 80 next to my place. After a week of soaking, I went back to the Steiger. I put the breaker bar back on the crank and pulled. This time I felt a slight give. Just a fraction of an inch, but it was something. I worked it back and forth, gently at first, then with more force. A groan came from deep within the engine, the sound of rust breaking its grip on steel. Slowly, painstakingly, the crankshaft began to turn. By noon, I could make a full, smooth rotation. It was alive. The next step was cleaning the cylinders. I rigged a hose from my air compressor and blew the oily mixture out of the injector holes. It came out in a fine red mist, coating the side of the tractor and the ground. Then I reinstalled the injectors with new copper washers and torqued them down to spec. I bought 2 massive new truck batteries and wrestled them into the battery box, hooking up the thick, heavy cables. The moment of truth. I climbed up the steel ladder into the cab. The seat was torn, the foam spilling out like yellow guts. The controls were simple. A throttle lever, a clutch pedal that took all my leg strength to push, and a forest of gear shift levers sprouting from the floor. I turned the key. The dash lights flickered. I hit the starter button. The big starter motor engaged with a heavy clunk, and the engine began to turn over, slow and rhythmic. Whoom. 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 It was turning too slow to fire. The batteries were new, but the old starter was drawing too many amps. I let it crank for 10 seconds, then stopped to let the starter cool. I tried again. Same thing. I was about to give up for the day when Henry pulled into the yard in his pickup. He got out and ambled over, chewing on a piece of hay. "Heard you trying to start the beast," he said. "No luck?" "Starter's weak," I said, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of a greasy hand. Henry nodded, looking at the big Detroit. "Those things need to spin fast to build up heat. Got any ether?" I kept a can of starting fluid for emergencies. We popped the lid off the air cleaner canister. Henry stood by with the can. "All right," he said, "crank it. When I nod, give it a little sniff. Just a little." I climbed back in the cab and hit the starter. Whoom, whoom, whoom. Henry nodded. I saw him give a quick, short spray into the air intake. The effect was instantaneous. A loud crack echoed from the engine, followed by a puff of white smoke from the exhaust stack. The engine's rhythm changed. It spun faster, catching fire on another cylinder. Whoom, bang, whoom, chug, bang. Another cylinder lit, then another. The whole tractor began to shake violently. Black smoke poured from the stack. The slow cranking turned into a rough, loping idle, and then, with a final deafening roar, all 8 cylinders came to life. The sound was apocalyptic. It wasn't the smooth rumble of a modern diesel. It was a clattering, screaming, hammering noise that vibrated in my bones and rattled the windows in the house 50 yards away. The ground trembled. My wife came out onto the back porch, her hands over her ears. Henry was grinning from ear to ear, his face already smudged with soot. I throttled it up, and the roar intensified, a symphony of controlled destruction. The beast was awake. The early 1970s were a golden age for farmers in our part of the world, or so it seemed. The news was full of stories about the great grain robbery. the massive sale of American wheat to the Soviet Union. Commodity prices shot through the roof. Corn, which had been bumping along at $1.50 a bushel for years, suddenly hit $3, then $3.50. Soybeans went even higher. It felt like you couldn't lose. The Secretary of Agriculture, a man named Earl Butz, was on the radio telling us to plant fence row to fence row. "Get big," he said. "The world is hungry." For men like Earl Thompson, it was a license to print money. The banks were practically throwing cash at farmers with interest rates that seemed impossibly low. Earl took full advantage. He bought that 80 acres next to me for a price that had been unthinkable just 2 years earlier. He tore out the old farmhouse and the grove of trees around it, pushing the dirt into the creek bed to gain another 2 acres of tillable ground. Then came the new equipment. He traded his John Deere 7520, which was barely broken in, for 2 brand-new, top-of-the-line Steiger Panther 3s. They were beautiful machines, painted in that iconic lime green, with comfortable, quiet cabs that had air conditioning and AM/FM radios. They were a world away from my rusty old barn-built monster. He bought a 24-row planter and a 40-foot field cultivator to go with them. His operation became a model of modern efficiency. At the coffee shop, he was hailed as a visionary, a man with the courage to seize the opportunity. He built a new, state-of-the-art grain handling system with a leg and a push-button control panel. While I was still unloading my old gleaner with a PTO-driven auger that took 20 minutes a load, Earl could dump a semi-truck full of corn in 5. He was the king of the county, and he knew it. Meanwhile, I kept on farming the way my father had taught me. The good prices were a blessing, no doubt about it. That first year with the old Steiger, I put it to work. I bought a used 21-foot chisel plow for a few $100s and hooked it on. The tractor didn't even seem to notice it was back there. I could pull it a gear higher and a mile an hour faster than anyone else in the county, turning over the soil deep, breaking up the hardpan that had built up over years of shallow tillage. The roar of that Detroit became a familiar sound in our part of the valley. People would stop their cars on the road to watch the ugly green machine work, belching smoke and pulling its guts out. It never broke down. It was too simple to break. It leaked oil from every seal. It was loud enough to make my ears ring for an hour after I shut it down, and it rode rougher than a buckboard wagon, but it always started, and it always pulled. The money I made in those boom years was more than I'd ever seen. My wife, Martha, wanted to remodel the kitchen. The kids needed braces. We could have bought a new car. But the memory of my father's stories was too strong. He'd seen farmers in the 1930s lose everything they had because they'd borrowed too much in the good times of the 1920s. So instead of expanding, I did the opposite. I took the profits from 1973 and paid off the last of the mortgage on our farm. I'll never forget the day. I walked into the bank and handed Mr. Abernathy, the bank president, a check for the final balance. He was a stern, old-school banker who had known my father. He looked at the check, then at me over his spectacles. "Silas," he said, a rare smile touching his lips, "your father would be very proud of you today. There aren't many young men who have the discipline to do this, especially not now." He stamped the note, paid in full, with a heavy, satisfying thud and handed it to me. I walked out of that bank feeling 10 feet tall. I owned it. All of it. Every last acre. No man could take it from me. The next year I did the same thing. I farmed my land, sold my grain, and took the profits and put them not into land or iron, but into certificates of deposit at that same bank. It felt strange. Earl Thompson was buying up the world, becoming a local legend. And I was taking my money out of the farm and locking it away in a savings account that paid 5% interest. The community's perception of me shifted from quiet respect to quiet pity. They saw me as a man who was afraid of risk, afraid of growth, afraid of the future. At church potlucks, the other farmers would talk about yields and land prices and their new 4-wheel drive tractors. I'd just nod and listen. Earl's wife would look at Martha with sympathetic eyes, as if she were married to a failure. One afternoon at the co-op, Earl cornered me while I was waiting for a load of fertilizer. "Silas, I just don't get you," he said, shaking his head. He wasn't being mean, not really. It was genuine confusion. You've got that old monster of yours. You can outwork any tractor in the county. You could be farming 1,000 acres right now. Why are you sitting on your hands?" "I'm farming what I own, Earl," I said simply. "But you're missing the boat. The price of land is going to double again in the next 5 years. You're letting the opportunity of a lifetime pass you by. You're going to wake up one day and be the last small farmer left, a dinosaur." I just shrugged. "Maybe so, but I sleep well at night." He clapped me on the shoulder, the same patronizing gesture from the auction. "Well, I wish you the best. I really do." He walked away, shaking his head, a man who simply could not comprehend a world that wasn't built on leverage and growth. The good years rolled on. 1974, 75, 76. Each year, the prices stayed high and the rains came at the right time. Earl's empire grew. He bought another farm, this one a full section, 640 acres. His debt must have been astronomical, but as long as the land values kept rising and the price of corn stayed strong, he was a genius on paper. His net worth was probably 10 times mine. I just kept on my path. I maintained my equipment, rebuilt the engine on the 4010, put new bearings in the gleaner. I bought nothing new. My cash reserves in the bank grew, slowly and steadily. I was a footnote in the story of the great 1970s farm boom, the cautionary tale of the man who was too timid to win. Then, in the fall of 1979, the first chill wind blew. It wasn't in the weather, it was in the news. I was at the bank, rolling over one of my CDs. Mr. Abernathy wasn't at his desk. I could hear his voice coming from his office, tight and strained. He was on the phone. "I don't care what the projections say," he was saying, his voice sharp. "This new man at the Fed, this Volcker, he's serious. He's going to whip inflation no matter who it hurts. Did you see what the prime rate did yesterday? It jumped a full point. A full point. How are my customers supposed to cash flow their operating loans at 15% interest?" There was a long pause. I saw Mr. Abernathy through the glass of his office door. He was rubbing his temples, his face pale. "No, you listen to me," he said into the phone. "We've got millions of dollars in agricultural loans out there based on $5 corn and 8% money. If the interest rate goes to 20 and the price of corn goes to 2, God help us all." He hung up the phone with a sharp crack. I finished my business with the teller and walked out into the bright autumn sunshine. I didn't know who Paul Volcker was, and I didn't fully understand what a prime rate was. But I understood the look on my banker's face. It was a look I'd seen on my father's face in old photographs from 1932. It was the look of fear. Across the street, Earl Thompson was just getting into a brand new Lincoln Continental, the fanciest car I'd ever seen in our small town. He gave me a little wave. I nodded back, but a cold knot was tightening in the pit of my stomach. The game was about to change, and I had a feeling that all of Earl's shiny iron and borrowed acres weren't going to be worth as much as he thought. The harvest was over, but a different kind of storm was gathering on the horizon. The summer of 1980 arrived not with gentle warmth, but with the fury of an open furnace. A brassy, cloudless sky clamped down over the county, and the sun beat on the fields with a physical weight. The corn, which had sprung from the ground full of promise in the wet spring, began to suffer. The leaves started to curl in on themselves by midday, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture, turning the vibrant green fields a sickly shade of grey. The rain simply stopped. The heat put a strain on everything, man and machine alike. One sweltering afternoon in early June, during the last pass of cultivation, I saw Earl Thompson's operation come to a dead stop in the middle of the field across the road. One of his magnificent Steiger Panther 3s just sat there, silent. A few hours later, the dealer's service truck rolled in, a clean white pickup with a crane on the back. It sat there for the rest of the day. The next morning, I saw Earl out by the road, waiting for the mechanic to return. I pulled my old pickup over. His face was slick with sweat, and his eyes were shot with red. He looked tired down to the bone. "Trouble, Earl?" I asked, leaning on my door. He kicked at a clod of dust. "Hydraulic pump went out, the main one. Took out the whole system. Can't steer it, can't lift the implement, can't do a damn thing. And get this," he said, his voice a bitter mix of anger and disbelief, "the part's on backorder in Des Moines. Might be here tomorrow, might be here next week. The mechanic says it'll be a $4,000 bill when it's all said and done. $4,000. That was 10 times what I'd paid for my entire tractor. It was more than my father had made in 3 years during the Depression. "That's a tough break," I said, and I meant it. "Tough break?" he scoffed. "I've got 600 acres of corn left to cultivate, and the weeds are coming on strong. Every day this thing sits, I'm losing yield. This isn't supposed to happen, it's a new machine." He gestured at it with disgust, as if it had personally betrayed him. 2 days later, my old Steiger decided to act up. I was pulling the chisel plow, breaking up some sod ground, when I felt the steering get heavy. I looked back and saw a fine mist of oil spraying from underneath the articulation joint. I shut it down immediately and climbed underneath. A hydraulic hose, probably 20 years old, had rubbed against the frame and finally burst. I got in my pickup and drove to the Napa Auto Parts store in town. The man behind the counter, a kid with greasy hair, looked at the old fitting I brought in. He rummaged around in the back and came out with a new length of high-pressure hose and 2 new threaded fittings. I paid him $28.50. Back at the farm, it took me an hour with 2 crescent wrenches lying on my back in the dirt to replace the hose. I topped off the hydraulic fluid, fired up the Detroit, and was back to work before the sun got low. As I worked, I could still see Earl's Panther, sitting idle and silent in the shimmering heat. The drought broke in late July with a series of violent thunderstorms that flattened more of the corn than they watered. The harvest was a disappointment for everyone. But the real trouble wasn't in the fields, it was on the financial pages. The news from the Federal Reserve was relentless. The prime interest rate, the number that governed all other loans, was climbing like a rocket. 15%, then 18%, then an almost unbelievable 21%. My operating loan for seed and fertilizer that spring had been at 9%. The note for the next year would be more than double that. For me, it was a worry. For Earl, it was a catastrophe. His entire empire, the land, the equipment, the massive grain system, was built on a mountain of debt. His payments were calculated on 8% money and $3 corn. Now he was facing 20% money, and because of a new grain embargo against the Soviets, corn was projected to drop back to $2 a bushel. The math no longer worked. The cracks in his empire began to show. He sold off his herd of cattle at a bad time, flooding the market when everyone else was doing the same. He started driving his old farm truck instead of the Lincoln. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a haunted, hunted look. He stopped coming to the coffee shop. The whispers started. People said the bank was calling him every day. They said he was trying to sell a piece of land, but land values had stalled, then started to fall. No one was buying. The golden age was over. The piper had come, and he was demanding to be paid. The winter of 1981 was bleak and bitter cold, but the chill that settled over the countryside had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cold dread of foreclosure. The local paper, which used to be filled with ads for new equipment and stories of record yields, was now filled with auction notices, page after page of them. They were small at first, a farmer retiring, an estate sale, but by the spring of 1982, they were different. They were bank-ordered liquidations. Good, hard-working families, some of whom had farmed the same ground for 100 years, were being sold out on the courthouse steps. Every auction was like a wake. The crowds were quiet, their faces grim. These weren't neighbors celebrating a retirement, they were vultures and survivors, picking through the bones of a failed dream, praying they wouldn't be next. The notice for Earl Thompson's auction appeared in late March. It was a full-page ad. Complete liquidation, it read, due to restructuring of assets. Everyone knew what that meant. The bank had finally pulled the plug. The list of equipment was staggering. 2 nearly new Steiger Panther throwers, a John Deere 8820 combine with both a corn and a bean head, a fleet of tractors, planters, cultivators, trucks, and wagons. At the bottom of the list, in stark cold print, 1,280 acres of prime farmland, to be sold in 5 separate parcels. The day of the auction was grey and cold, with a raw wind that cut through your coat. The crowd was the biggest I'd ever seen. They parked cars and pickups for a mile in each direction along the gravel road. The yard that had once been a showcase of modern farming was now an open-air museum of broken promises. The shiny green paint of the equipment seemed to mock the occasion. I saw Earl standing near the house, a ghost at his own funeral. His wife was beside him, her face pale and tear-streaked. He looked like he had aged 20 years in the last 2. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes hollow. He wasn't the king of the county anymore. He was just another man who had lost everything. Mr. Abernathy, the bank president, was there, his face set like granite. He avoided eye contact, conferring quietly with the auctioneers. He wasn't a villain in this story, not really. He was just a man caught in the same economic storm, trying to keep his own ship from sinking. He had lent the money when times were good. Now he had to collect it when times were bad. It was just business. I didn't go there to bid on his equipment. My old machines were slow and ugly, but they were mine. They didn't come with a monthly payment book. While other farmers were struggling to make interest payments that were bigger than my total operating budget, I was secure. The low grain prices hurt, but they didn't threaten to take my home. The CDs I had bought with the profits from the good years were now my lifeline. They paid for my seed and fuel with cash. The whispers in the community had changed. I was no longer the timid fool who missed the boat. Now I was the lucky one, the wise one, the survivor. But I felt no joy in it. Watching Earl's life get dismantled piece by piece was a painful, sobering thing. The auctioneers started with the small items, the tools and shop equipment. Then they moved to the big iron. The prices were heartbreakingly low. A 4-wheel drive tractor that Earl had paid over $100,000 for just 3 years earlier sold for $35,000. The combine went for a fraction of its worth. Men were buying $10 bills for $5, but no one was smiling. Every farmer there knew it was only by the grace of God that they were the ones bidding, and not the ones being sold out. I stayed through it all, a silent observer. I watched as Earl's empire was reduced to a stack of receipts in the auctioneer's Clark trailer. I survived because I had listened to the ghosts of the past, to the lessons of scarcity my father had drilled into me. I had farmed with paid for iron and paid for land. I had treated the boom years not as a new reality, but as a temporary gift, a chance to build a fortress against the inevitable lean times. While Earl was building a glass palace on a foundation of sand, I had been digging a storm cellar. And now the storm was raging. Finally, late in the afternoon, the auctioneer climbed onto the flatbed trailer to sell the last and most important asset, the land. "All right, folks, this is what you've all been waiting for," his voice rasped, tired from a long day of chanting. "We are going to sell the heart of the Thompson operation, the home quarter. 160 acres with a fine house, barn, and a complete grain handling facility." He was talking about the original Thompson farm, the piece of ground Earl's grandfather had homesteaded. It was the land right across the road from me. It was good, flat, black dirt, some of the best in the county. A hush fell over the crowd. This was different from selling iron. This was selling a man's roots, his heritage. "What am I bid?" the auctioneer began. "Let's start the bidding at $2,000 an acre. Who'll give me $2,000? Silence. 2 years ago, land like this was selling for $3,000, even $4,000. But the world had turned upside down. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. "Folks, this is prime land. Let's get it started." $1,800 an acre? Somebody give me $1,800. A man in the front, a well-known land speculator from the city, raised a finger. $1,000, he said, his voice smug. He was smelling blood, hoping to steal the farm for pennies on the dollar. The auctioneer's face fell. $1,000 is the bid. Do I hear $1,100? Another speculator bid $1,050. They were going to carve it up, piece by piece, for next to nothing. I looked over at Earl. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. He was watching his birthright being picked apart by strangers. Something inside me broke. This wasn't right. This wasn't how it should end. I had never borrowed money to buy land in my life. I had never paid interest on an acre of ground. But I had my savings. The money I had so carefully put away was sitting in the bank, earning interest. It was my safety net. I thought about my father. I thought about the lessons. If you can't pay cash, you can't afford it. I had the cash. 1,500, I said. My voice cut through the quiet murmuring. Every head turned toward me. The city speculator glared. Earl's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. Mr. Abernathy, the banker, looked at me, a flicker of something, surprise, respect, in his eyes. 1,500 is the bid from Silas Blackwood, the auctioneer boomed, his energy returning. Now we're talking. Do I hear 16? The speculator bid 1,550. 1,600, I said, my voice firm, not looking at him, but at the auctioneer. The man countered with 1,650. He was testing me, trying to see if I was serious. 1,800, I said, jumping the bid. I wanted to send a message. I wasn't here to play games. A gasp went through the crowd. That was a real price, a fair price in this new, broken economy. It was more than the speculators wanted to pay. The man looked at me, then at his partner, and shook his head. He was out. $1,800 an acre, the auctioneer called out, scanning the crowd. Going once, going twice. He looked at me, and I gave a slow, deliberate nod. Sold, for $1,800 an acre, to Silas Blackwood. A wave of applause, quiet and respectful, rippled through the farmers in the crowd. They weren't clapping because I'd bought a farm. They were clapping because one of their own had stopped the vultures at the gate. I hadn't just bought land, I had preserved a neighbor's dignity. After the auctioneer climbed down, I walked over to where Earl was standing alone, his family having gone inside the house. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared at the ground, his shoulders shaking. I suppose you're here to gloat, Silas, he said, his voice thick with shame. You were right all along. You won. This isn't a game, Earl, I said quietly, and nobody won today. I waited a moment, letting the silence hang between us. I want to make you an offer. I'll rent the farm back to you. The house, the barns, the whole quarter. You can farm it. We'll work out a fair crop share lease. And you and your family can stay in the house for as long as you need, a year at least, to get back on your feet. No rent on the house. He finally looked up, his eyes swimming with confusion and tears. Why? Why would you do that? After all the times I made fun of you, of your old tractor. Because that's what neighbors are supposed to do, I said. And because that old house has been a Thompson house for 3 generations. It ought to stay that way for a while longer. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, a broken man, and wept. And in that moment, all the rivalry, all the pride and arrogance, it all just washed away in the cold March wind. Life went on. The farm crisis of the 80s eventually bottomed out, and the slow, painful recovery began. Earl and his family stayed in their house. He farmed his home place, and I farmed mine. We became friends, a real friendship forged not in prosperity, but in hardship and humility. He never tried to expand again. He farmed his 160 acres, and he did it well. He taught his sons the value of a hard day's work and the danger of easy debt. Years turned into decades. My own son grew up and decided he wanted to farm. I gave him the same advice my father gave me. We bought another piece of ground, but only when we could pay for it with cash from the good years. One crisp fall afternoon, probably 15 years after that auction, my grandson, who was about 10 at the time, was out in the machine shed with me. The old barn-built Steiger was parked in the corner, covered in a fine layer of dust. It didn't see much field work anymore. We had a newer, more comfortable tractor for that. But I could never bring myself to sell it. It was like a monument. Grandpa, my grandson asked, running his hand over one of the massive cracked tires, why do you keep this old thing? It's so loud and ugly. I smiled and wiped a patch of dust off the faded green hood. This old tractor, I told him, taught me the most important lesson there is. It's not about having the newest or the biggest or the shiniest. It's about owning what you have. This tractor doesn't owe us a dime, and we don't owe anyone a dime for it. Every time it runs, it's making us money, not a banker. I leaned against the cool steel frame, the smell of old diesel and grease filling my senses. There will always be good times and bad times. The trick is to use the good times to prepare for the bad. You save, you stay out of debt, and you take care of what you've got. You do that, and you'll never have to watch a stranger sell your life out from under you. He looked from the tractor to me, his young eyes trying to understand the weight of my words. I knew he didn't fully get it yet. But someday he would. I looked out the big shed door, across my fields, toward the Thompson place. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The land was quiet, resting after the harvest. It was my land, free and clear. Paid for not just with money, but with patience, with discipline, and with the wisdom of generations. Earl Thompson had played the game to get big. I had just played to stay. And in the end, staying was the only victory that mattered.